This session is going to look at how you can use classifier scores to identify records that are of interest to your group. As part of Project Transform, classifier scores are being applied to all records within the CRSD. So that means all central records, all records in reviews, all records in registers. At the moment, it's being applied to reference records, so it'll be every reference that appears in your segment or in your register. But there are plans to apply it to other types of records at a later date. I think the easiest way to look at how useful classifier scores are is to talk you through a live example. So what we have here is the ENT CRS web interface. You can see that we've got a new dashboard panel which is called My Classifier. To get that active, if it's not already active on your dashboard, you simply go to Configure and choose a window that you want to change to My Classifier and choose My Classifier as the window that will be. What that should then show you is the number of records that the classifier has identified in the whole of CRSD that it thinks has a greater than 90% chance of being of interest to your group and that isn't already in your segment. So what it's doing is looking at all the records in CRSD, finding the ones that it thinks are of interest to you based on the signature that it's generated from your register. So it took your register as the starting point, abstracted some rules about what looked interesting and what didn't, and then applied those rules to records that were not in your register. So we can see from this panel here that within the ENT group we've got 3,754 records that it's identified of potential interest. Now the first thing to say is if you don't want to use the classifier, then you don't need to do anything with this. You know, there's no extra work involved here if you don't want there to be. All this is doing is saying here's some records, have a look at them, make some decisions about whether they are or aren't of interest to you. So to get to those records, all you do is to click on the panel, the same as you do with the other panels, and that will take you into the usual search screen, record screen, where you can see that it's run the search on the classifier values to find those between 90 and 100% that are not in your segment. And here's the list of records that it's found. So there's 3,754, and we can go and look at those records and see whether they are of interest to us or not. And the first thing you'll notice is that there's an additional tab now on the record display called the Classifier tab. And if we click on that, you can see the values that the classifier has found. It's worth going through what we're seeing here. The first thing is that this is a bar chart, obviously, and the values are the values that the classifier has determined as the percentage probability that this particular record that we're looking at up here is of interest to each of these groups. The first bar is your bar, so we're in the ENT group at the moment, so the ENT bar will always be up here as the first one, so you don't have to go searching for it. And what the classifier has said is that this record is, it's 94% sure that this record is of interest to your group, and given that you don't have it, you would probably want to go and look at it. So to do that, you click on the fields and you can go and look at the record and make some decisions about whether you'd want to include it in your register or not. If we go back to the classifier, we can actually just skip through the records one at a time and it'll show us the graph for all of the groups that it thinks these records are of interest to. And because we've told it in the original search to find ones that are of interest to us, then we're going to find that these values up here are always 90, well, somewhere between 90 and 100%. A couple of other things to talk about on this graph. The first is the colours. So if the bar is purple, it means this record is already in the register of the group that you're looking at. So if this was a purple bar, it would mean that the record is in the ENT register. If this were a purple bar, it would mean that it was in the Airways register. If the bar is blue, it means that it's in the segment. So with this case, we know that this record is in the Airways segment, and not surprisingly, because it's flagged as 97% likely to be of interest to Airways. And if it's not in the segment, then it's a green bar. And what you tend to find, it's quite interesting to look at the figures, because what you tend to find is that there's a distribution where there's quite a few at the top of the distribution where it's decided that things really are of interest to a particular group. And then there'll be a gap, and then there's quite a long tail where it's decided that things are not really of very much interest to any of these groups. So anything down here at 30% is probably not of any interest to that group. Couple of things you can do from here. The first is if you decide that this record is not relevant to your group, so you've looked at it, you've seen that it says, the classifier says it's 99% relevant, you say it isn't, you just click on the not relevant to my group. It says, are you sure you want to flag this as not of no interest to your group? Not active yet in this version. And you would say yes. And what that would do would be to remove the score from that record, and it wouldn't then come up as being relevant to your group ever again. The other thing you can do, again, not in this version, but probably in the next version, is if you spot something that's of interest to a group. So this one, for example, is of interest to the hypertension group, and you've gone through and looked at it, and you've decided maybe that it's not of interest to your group, but actually you've spent the time looking at it, and it's perfectly obvious that it is of interest to the hypertension group. You know they haven't got it because it's green, which means it's not in their segment. You can just click on that bar, and what that will do, again in the next version, what that will do is to set an alert for the hypertension group to say that someone has looked at a record and confirmed that it looks as though it very is likely to be of interest to their group, so they might want to go and look at it. So we'll just click no for now. There's lots of plans to do more things with the figures, so certainly a lot more experimentation needs to be done on where the cutoff values lie. We've chosen 90 to 100% for the first run through, and what we're looking for is some feedback as to whether that's getting the right records or not, or whether we need to set those parameters lower or higher. At the moment, it's returning for this group, returning 3,500 records, which is a lot of records. So maybe we want to set that higher as a default. And of course, we'll be bringing back in the ability for you to set your own thresholds in a future version, probably not the next version, but the one after that. So maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time, that'll be in place. So that's a quick run through on the classifier values. As always, it will be really good to get feedback as to how useful you find this or ways that we can make it better. Thanks very much.